When we learned this next concept in class, we called it factoring quadratics, which is why I wrote that title up here. However, Khan Academy calls this same concept factoring polynomials 1. So you will see that title here as well. Okay, so let's talk about how we factor quadratics. We start factoring quadratics by drawing a diamond and a generic rectangle. Okay, now let's identify the format of our quadratics. So quadratics are written in the format of ax squared plus bx plus c. We can see that we are given this quadratic right here, which is x squared minus 6x plus 8. We take the ax squared term and we place it in one corner of our generic rectangle. So in this case, I'm going to put an x squared here. We take the c and we put it in the diagonal of the ax squared term. So my c in this case is a positive 8. Put 8 here. The top of my diamond is my product and I'm going to get this number by taking the ax squared term and multiplying it by my c term. So I take ax squared, which again in this case is x squared, and c, which is 8, and I multiply them together. So I'm just going to write that here so I can see what I've done here. And I get 8x squared in this case. The bottom of my generic rectangle is my sum. And I find this number from my original equation. It is the bx term. So let's go back and look at my original equation. My bx term is negative 6x. Okay, so let's go back to basic math vocabulary. Product is the answer to a multiplication problem. The sum is the answer to an addition problem. So I'm going to use these two numbers, and I want to figure out what two factors multiply to positive 8x squared and add to negative 6x. Let's think about this. I know that if they add to a negative number, I have to have at least one negative number. Well, if I look at what they multiply to a positive. So since they multiply to a positive, the only way that's going to happen and still add to a negative is if they're both negative. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write my negatives. I have to multiply to an x squared and add to an x. So I know that they're both going to have an x with them. So now I just start with my factors of 8. So I can say negative 1 and negative 8. That would multiply to the right thing, but it would not add to the right thing. So that doesn't work. Okay, negative 2. So negative 2 times negative 4. That would multiply to a positive 8. Negative 2 plus negative 4 would in fact give me negative 6. So I'm going to have negative 2x and negative 4x. So negative 2x times negative 4x gives me a positive 8x squared. Negative 2x plus negative 4x gives me negative 6x. So these do work. So I take these two numbers and I plug them in the empty places in my generic rectangle. So now I pull out the greatest common factor. So I look at these two numbers and I say, okay, what do they have in common? Well, I see that they have an x in common. So I'm going to write that x. I look at these two numbers. What do they have in common? The biggest thing they have in common, a 4. I see a 4. Okay? It's the biggest thing that these two numbers have in common. I see an x. And these two terms, I see a 2. But I'm not done yet. I have to check this. Okay, x times x. Yes, that is x squared. X times 4. That's not a negative 4x. It's a positive 4x. So to make it negative, I have to make this negative. Okay, so now let's check. Is negative 4 times x negative 4x? Yes, it is. Okay? Is x times 2 negative 2x? No. So I'm going to make this negative. You always make the number negative before the variable. Okay, so now this works. And then lastly, is negative 4 times a negative 2 a positive 8? Absolutely. So the final step here is that I have to write out the factored form. So I'm going to write this out as quantity x minus 2 times the quantity x minus 4. And that is my final answer here. And be aware, order doesn't matter in multiplication, so you could have just as easily written this as x minus 4 times the quantity x minus 2. That is equally acceptable.